This video is sponsored by Squarespace. From websites and online stores to marketing tools and analytics, Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business.
Oh, hi. Welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built out my entire recording booth, but more specifically, I'm going to show you how I did this custom floating walnut desk with inlaid brass lettering. So, follow along, check out the video description for links to all the products I used, all the different materials. There's also a link down there to our Patreon page. If you want to get more involved in the channel, get a bunch of behind the scenes access, enter a contest for me to come out and build a project with you, and get a bunch of coupon codes and cool stuff like that, well, just follow that link. But for now, enjoy the video. I'm just gonna kick back here in my Knicks boots and look at some pictures of puppies. Ooh. That one looks like a lady.
White snow, red sky, reach out for so.
Now, you've probably seen in my last couple videos that over the course of the last few months, I've been working on building myself a new office space. I showed you the giant built-ins that I built with Keith Johnson, and then last time I showed you the decorative casing that I did around the interior. Now it's time to build out my sound booth. Now, I've needed one of these for a long time, because whether you realize it or not, I've always done my voiceovers in my closet. It's not even a walk-in closet, just a tiny little coat closet. And I shove myself in there with my computer and a microphone, and it's hot and sweaty, and it's time for an upgrade. So for this project, I want to build myself a floating walnut desk to set my computer on, and then I want to do something for sound insulation on the walls. So the first thing I needed to do was take some measurements so I knew exactly how big of a desk I needed to make. Now the concept of this desk is going to be a walnut top with 3 walnut drawer faces below it. You know, for storing candy and paper and extra batteries and paper clips and all the fun things you shove in a desk. So I got myself some nice 6/4 walnut and I set to work milling it down. Whenever I start milling lumber for any piece, the first thing I do is chop it down roughly to length, giving myself a little bit extra to trim down at the very end. I do this because it's a lot easier to wrestle smaller boards through the joiner and planer than it is longer ones. So just chop off the excess and throw it in the scrap wood pile. I mean, you could use it for something, but let's be honest, I'll probably just burn it later. I mean, it's just black walnut. After joining a square edge on one side, I take the boards over to the table saw and I cut them to the correct width. I figured out that I could use 3 boards to get my depth that I was looking for, which is going to be 22 inches deep for this walnut floating desk. After I cut them to the correct width, I take them over to the planer so that I get a nice smooth surface on both sides. After shoving every board through the planer for a little bit, I'm finally ready to haul them over to my work surface, lay them out, and see if they come together nicely. There's 1 board, here's 2 boards, and finally a 3rd board. And look at that, those things plop together like they were always meant to be. One uniformed slab. Purty. Because we did such a fantastic job milling these down, I'm not going to put any biscuits or dominoes in between these seams. I'm just going to slap them together with a little glue, put some clamps on there, and walk away and let nature take its course. So I grabbed my squeeze bottle of glue, and honing my skills from when I worked at Hot Dog on a Stick, I smeared some glue on there just like mustard on a good old Coney hot dog. Then I set them down in between my clamps and squeeze. Well, technically I didn't squeeze, the clamps did the squeezing, but I tightened the clamps so that they could squeeze. Making sure to put clamps both on the bottom and the top to keep the whole thing from warping up like a taco. And I was ready to move on to phase 2. What's phase 2, you ask? Well, that's going to be building the underframe that's going to hold our walnut desktop, as well as create a space for us to put our drawers. So once again, it was back over to the miter saw to start milling up some wood. After roughly cutting it to length, I went back to the joiner. I got a nice straight edge on one side. After that was accomplished, I went back to the table saw, and once again, I cut it to the correct width. I think I did right around 3.5 inches. Now I know that doesn't leave a lot of room for drawers, but I didn't want the drawers to be too deep because then there's no place for you to put your knees. And you kind of need to put your knees somewhere under a desk, or else you're going to have to sit to the side all awkward with your knees pointing one way and your face pointing the other, and that's how back injuries happen. The first thing I did was cut my back frame piece to length, and then I carried it into my little recording room to make sure it would fit in between those walls. Now I wanted a nice snug fit, but not so snug that I couldn't get it in place. So this was just about perfect. I could wiggle it in there, but it wasn't too loose from left to right. After I determined that this piece would work perfectly, I could haul that piece inside and start working on the rest of my frame, which is going to look something like this. I'm going to have my back piece that goes against the wall and is anchored into studs. I'm going to have these two side pieces. Those are going to be anchored into studs as well, and my whole walnut top will rest on those. Then I'm going to have these middle pieces. Now these are going to give a little support to my walnut top in the form of kind of a cantilevered effect, but they're also going to break up that under space and allow me to have dividers for my drawers. Now I wanted to give these as much support as possible, so I decided to half lap all these pieces into my back support piece. So just using my pieces as a reference, I scored a little line where I needed to carve out for a half lap. Then after doing the math to determine how much space I needed in between each drawer divider, I cut a little scrap piece of wood that was that exact size. This will allow me to line up all my half laps in the middle, and I'm going to save this scrap piece and use it later. Just wait, I'll show you when we get to that step. It'll come in pretty handy. So with my scrap piece determining that all my pieces are landing in the right place, I scored out lines in the middle for those half laps as well. Then I took that back brace piece over to my miter saw to cut out my half laps. Now I could do this on the crosscut sled with the dado stack, but they're so small I figured I'll just use the trenching feature on my miter saw and get it done in no time. So a zip, zap, zoop, and a little more zoopage, and we've got our half laps cut, and they look something like this. And it was at this point that I realized these aren't really half laps. I mean, I've been calling them that, but they're pretty much just a dado, or the ones on the end, since they're open, would be a rabbit. So I don't know why I've been calling them half laps. They're just slots that I shove wood in. There's really no laps that are being halved here. Anyways, I test fit all my pieces into these grooves that I cut, whatever the heck you want to call them, to make sure they were nice and snug. Now there's still one thing I needed to figure out, and that was how we're going to attach the top to this underframe. But thankfully, I've got a plan for that. Just wait. With all my boards dry fit together in the correct orientation, I marked the top on all the pieces so that I could get them lined back up in this exact same way. Once I had the top marked on all the pieces, just with a few scribbles from the pencil, I took the pieces over to the table saw and I cut a 1/4 inch groove a 1/2 inch down from the top. Why, you ask? Well, it's because I'm going to use these little Z fasteners to attach the desktop to the underframe. These Z fasteners slide into the 1/4 inch groove here, and then they got this little Z-shaped piece, and you put a screw to attach the top. I like using these Z fasteners because they allow for wood movement, so that Z fastener can flex a little bit if the top wants to move. So I just continued that groove all the way around on all of my pieces, and then I was ready to glue up my whole underframe and get this thing assembled. So I marked out the center of each one of my dadoed and rabbited grooves, and then using a countersink bit from the back side, I pre-drilled a few holes. I'm going to be hooking all of my little support pieces together with screws, number 1 for added strength, and number 2 because I don't want to wait around for glue to dry and have to clamp the whole thing up. After pre-drilling my little countersunk holes, I slather some glue inside those dados, and I smush in my little drawer dividers and outer support pieces. Once I have them firmly smushed in place and making sure they're square using some of those woodpecker's right angle clampy things, I pre-drill both holes and I drive in a 4-inch Power Pro fastener. Wood fastener, to be exact. And just like that, we have our underframe entirely assembled. We got our groove all the way around so that we can hook the top on with these Z fasteners. The top will rest on the back and both sides, and then these center supports will kind of act as cantilevers to support the middle even more. With that done, it was time to take our top out of clamps and keep the ball moving on this project. So I took the clamps off of our top, which was now good and dry and hooked together, and I was about ready for a nap. So I just climbed on up there and took a little snoozy snooze. But I won't make you watch that whole part. Now, I was pretty sure that the thickness of my walnut top was going to be plenty to support the weight of the desk, but I just wanted to double check. So I stretched it across a span about the size of my desk, and I gave it the good old testaroo. And what do you know? It's pretty darn sturdy, so don't have to worry about that. Then I just cut my desktop to length, making sure that it would fit nicely in between my two walls, using the Festool track saw. Festool, where tools are tools. Not sponsored. And then it was time to sand. Luckily I had my IsoTune freeze in so I could jam out while I did so. I am sponsored by them. There's a link in the video description. And I sanded and sanded until the entire top was nice and smooth. Then I carried the whole top over and I set it on my underframe to make sure that it would fit the way I wanted it to. And boy, am I glad that I tested this before installing that underframe, because guess what? I'm a moron. And I didn't take my measurements correctly, and my underframe was, well, too big. Look at my face. Horrible defeat is setting in right now as I realize, oh jeez. It should be under the top about 1.5 inches, and it's sticking proud about 1/4 inch. Somewhere I messed up. You see, what happened is I measured from the inside to the outside, and I didn't account for the thickness of my back support. Should have measured from the back to the front. So now I'm gonna have to cut this entire thing down, but it's already glued up and screwed together. Luckily, I've got a track saw. So I just awkwardly clamped a track onto each one of these things, and a zip, zap, zoop, I just cut them down. I'm not sure a track saw was intended to be used in this manner, but I gotta tell you, it sure made it easy to trim this thing down a little bit. And in no time, we were back on track. Haha, track saw joke. Then I set my top back on the underframe, and what do you know? Now the frame sits back under the top a good 1.5 inches. Now, why does it need to do this? Because we need room for our drawer faces to sit underneath there and still have a little reveal on the top. So we should be good to go. I went ahead and slathered some finish on my top as well as that underframe to get them all done and out of the way so I could move on to the next steps. To finish the tops, I'm just using a little Rubio Monocoat Pure. I was going to use Odie's oil, but I'm not a communist. If you know, you know. And in no time, that walnut was looking purty, all oiled up, like the Gulf of Mexico after BP's been there. It's been long enough that I can make that joke, right? I mean, that's not too inappropriate. You can't say it's too soon, that was years ago. Anyways, my point is I got all my pieces oiled. Now it was time to install them in my sound booth. So I went in, I measured the height that I wanted my desk to land at. I drew a line on the wall. Now this is going to be the top of my underframe, and then I used a level just to continue that line around and make sure everything was, well, level. Hence the reason I'm using a level. Once I had my landing zone all marked out, I used a stud finder just to mark where all my studs were so I would know exactly where I needed to land screws to anchor this thing firmly in place between those two walls. Then it was time to carry this thing in. Now normally I would be very cautious about not dinging up my drywall, but I'm actually going to be covering up all the drywall with sound dampening tiles, so I really didn't care if I scratched up my drywall or not, which was kind of refreshing because I could just bang and pound and pound and bang until I got this thing in place. And well, the drywall was a little bit of a mess, but who cares? Then I just pre-drilled with a countersink bit again and sank in some screws. I think I put like 8 screws in total, and I will say that's probably a little overkill. You probably only need like 4, but it's not going anywhere. I can say that for certain. And I was surprised these middle supports are actually pretty stout just with those screws on the back. Now you would think the next natural step would be to just put the top on that frame, but for some reason I abandoned that and started working on drawer faces, so I guess we're doing this now. Now I wanted to do the drawer faces out of one solid piece so I could do grain matched fronts all the way across. So I picked out a piece of walnut that was going to be wide enough and long enough, and I roughly cut it to length. And then, you guessed it, back over to the joiner. Seems like I always have to go through this process every time I want to build something. You gotta join it, you gotta plane it, you gotta run it through the table saw. It gets a little exhausting, but it's just one of those necessary steps, I guess. Once I had the board all milled up and looking pretty, I went back to the table saw and I cut it to width. Remember, our underframe's about 3.5 inches, so I cut this board to about 3 5/8, just so I had a little bit of an overhang on the bottom. With my board all milled down and the correct width, I went over to the miter saw and I cut it to the exact length to fit perfectly in between those two walls. Now you might be saying, well, when you cut it down into the individual drawer pieces, aren't you going to lose some material? Well, that's what I'm accounting for the reveals in between my drawers, so just don't worry, it'll all work out in the end. Next, I lightly sanded it so it was more pleasing to the touch. You know, didn't want to get splinters. And then it was time to start cutting it up into its individual parts and pieces for my drawer faces. Now I'm going to cut 3 drawer faces, but I'm also going to cut 2 little tabs, one on either side of the desk. This is going to make it so that the drawers don't start right up against the wall and scrape the wall or run into the door trim. It's going to bring the drawers in a little bit from the outside. So I mark out for those 2 tabs and I label each one with a piece of tape. I want to make sure to label all my parts and pieces in this process so that I can get everything put back together and the grain will match. So after marking out for my little tabs on either side, I take the piece back over to my miter saw and I cut those pieces off, making sure to cut on the inside of the line so they are the correct width. First I cut one very carefully and set it aside and save it. Then I flip the whole board around and I cut the tab off of the other side. Well, I guess I didn't flip the board around, I just kind of slid the board through. Again, making sure to cut on the inside of the line. Zip, zap, loop, just like that. Now I got my 2 little tabs, one for either end. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, don't worry, you'll understand later. Next, I take the rest of my board and I measure it out and do a little math to divide it into thirds. There goes my tape measure. Once I figure out the length of each individual drawer piece, I mark out the length, and then using a piece of tape, I mark each piece with a number, again so that I can get them back into that correct orientation and we can make sure that that grain continues to match on all of my drawer faces. Then I go over to my miter saw and this time I'm going to cut directly on the line. This way I'll have a perfect 1/8 inch gap in between each drawer face because the saw blade's an 1/8 inch thick and I'm removing that material in between each drawer face, if that makes sense. Then I take all my pieces back over to the table and I lay them out in the correct order and just make sure I did everything right and the grain is still matching up and it looks the way that it should, which it does. 3 drawers in the middle and 2 little tabs on the outside. And then I had this spur-of-the-moment idea to jazz up the drawer faces a little bit with some inlaid brass epoxy. So I got out my Shaper Origin, I designed a little bourbon, a little moth, and a little moth logo, one for each drawer face, and using my robot CNC, which is the Shaper Origin, I started carving out for my little inlaid epoxy pours. Inlaid epoxy pours? I know what you're thinking. Who are you and what have you done with Jason? Don't you hate epoxy? And it's true, normally I do hate epoxy, but that's more specific to river tables and, ugly things like that. I thought some inlaid brass epoxy would actually look pretty cool. And I got this Shaper, so I decided to go for it. A decision I might live to regret. Just wait and you'll see what I'm talking about. But with all of my lettering and logo carved out, I grabbed some Total Boat high performance epoxy and I started mixing it together. First I just mixed the 2 parts of epoxy, and then to give it the look of inlaid brass, I added some straight brass powder. This isn't hard to come by. I just ordered it on Amazon and it was prime, so it came the next day. And I just mixed a boatload, haha, Total Boat joke, of the brass powder into the epoxy and 1 little scoop of gold pigment just to keep it from being too green. Sometimes the brass powder wants to make it look kind of green. And then using a syringe, I started filling in all of my lettering, very carefully not to make too big of a mess. This is actually kind of fun. I felt like a doctor in some weird back alley clinic that people come to me when they get like gunshots and they don't want to go to the real hospital. And apparently I inject them with epoxy. I'm a horrible doctor. Anyways, I squirted my brass epoxy in all the various holes and I used a torch to get rid of all the bubbles. Then, because it was going to take a while for this epoxy to dry, I moved on to something else, and that was installing the desktop on top of my underframe in the office space. So I carried the desktop in and very carefully I squeezed it between those 2 walls and bumped the camera apparently. But I gave it a little shimmy, I gave it a little shake, and I slid that thing into place and it fit perfectly. Now all I had to do was secure it to that underbase with my little Z fasteners. Now remember when I cut this little spacer piece when I was aligning my brace pieces on the underframe and I said I'm going to save this and use it later? Well, by squeezing it in the front, I can ensure that all of my little drawer dividers are evenly spaced. So I just squeeze it in one, attach the top, and then move on down, squeeze it in the other one, attach the top down there, and I know all my little divided spaces are even. And then I gave it the good old shake test. That's where I sit on top of it and shake like I'm in a Jeep on a dirt road. And it is pretty darn secure. Now let's go learn about a mistake I made with my brass epoxy. You see, the thing when you add brass powder to epoxy is that brass is pretty heavy. So as it dries, all the concentrated brass likes to soak down to the bottom of your pour. So every time I sent it through the drum sander, the brass got a little brighter and a little more vivid. And I kept telling myself, ooh, just one more pass. Just one more pass. Well, I took one pass too many. And I did something really, really stupid. I wasn't keeping track of how much material I was taking off, and I sanded all the way through my brass epoxy down to the walnut underneath. And it looked like this. Kinda like a moth that my 7-year-old drew. Now I could play this off and say, hey, this is intentional, it's weathered, it's aged. But between you and me, I just really messed up. The letters were pretty bad too. In some spots it just completely got rid of the brass altogether. Now, I could redo this entire thing, and if I was building this for a client, hands down, I would just start over and build new drawer faces. But I'm not building this for a client. I'm building it for myself. And at the end of the day, I kind of like the idea of leaving a mistake front and center right where I'm going to sit and work each and every day. It's going to be a nice reminder that I still make mistakes, I'm still learning, and I can still improve. At least that's what I'm telling myself, when in all honesty I'm just being lazy and I don't want to redo it. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, get off my back. I've got an ugly, inlaid brass epoxy desk front. But the brass epoxy is pretty cool. Total boat, baby. So after finishing my drawer fronts with a little Rubio monocoat, I needed time for those to dry. So while I waited for those to dry, I was going to start working on the sound dampening tiles on the wall in my little office. Now, a lot of sound dampening tiles look pretty stock and kind of ugly, but I found these felt ones on Amazon and they actually look pretty snazzy, and they're super easy to install. You just peel off the back and they got this built-in adhesive, and you just stick them to the wall. And you can just cut them with a razor blade or a pair of scissors when you need to make cuts to fit around outlets and the such. So I started working my way around the room. When I got to the desk, before I did my felt tiles around the desk, I needed to add these little tabs on either side that were going to be on the outside of my drawer faces. So I just used a little CA glue on the outside, a little wood glue on the inside. I spaced it down from the top of the desk an 1/8 of an inch. I pressed it on there, and boom, installed. And I did the same thing over on the other side. This is going to give me a good bump out from the wall for my drawers to open and avoid scraping against the wall or hitting that door trim right there. With those installed, I could continue with my felt panels, like this one. That was fun to do, but it's sure satisfying when you get something to fit perfect. Yeah, the felt scribe. Classic. Maybe now would be a good time to talk about another huge mistake I made on this project, and that's underestimating how many felt tiles I would need to do this entire room. I thought I ordered way too many, and I only had enough to do 2 walls. How did this happen? Well, I think it started back in elementary school when I realized I wasn't good at math, and the problems kind of plagued me my entire life. Hence the fact that I've only got enough tiles to do half of my space. But Amazon says they'll be here tomorrow, so hopefully by the end of this build, I'll have all the walls done. For now, I'll just keep moving the ball forward on the desk, and that means installing my undermount drawer slides. Now these are Bloom undermount drawer slides. I picked these up on Rockler's website. Now these drawer slides can be hard to find right now, but Rockler had them in stock. So go get yourself some. After installing all 3 of my drawer slides, I took measurements directly off the slides to build my drawer boxes. Now these might be the skinniest drawer boxes I have ever made in my life. They're only about 2 3/4 inches tall. So I cut a bunch of thin strips of Baltic birch, added a groove for my lower panel, and cut up all my pieces. I pre-sanded all my pieces nice and lightly, and if you want a more detailed, in-depth, step-by-step of how I build drawer boxes, there's a video on my YouTube channel where I'll teach you all about it. But for now, I just glue and tack my drawer boxes together, and voila! 1 done, 2 to go. After getting all 3 of my drawer boxes made, I added my little clips for my Bloom drawer slides, just screwed them on the bottom of the drawer, and once those were in place, I used this cool little jig I got on Rockler to pre-drill my little holes on the back to lock the drawers into the slides. And if I wasn't feeling bad enough already about all my mistakes, the foreman stopped by, and he just had to point out the fact that 2 of the walls were done and 2 of them were empty. Why aren't these walls done? Why do you have felt over here and not over there? Get off my back, man. Jeez, sometimes he just likes to crack the whip. Anyways, with my drawer boxes done, I clipped them into those undermount drawer slides, nice and easy, dare I say lemon squeezy, and we were ready to install our drawer faces and finally be done with this desk. I mean, this desk looks like it should be easy, and it should have been, but for some reason, man, I had some issues with this one. So I grabbed the world's prettiest drawer faces with the most professionally done brass epoxy inlay. I clamped them in place on the front of my drawer faces, making sure to space them out evenly so there was a nice 1/8 inch reveal in between each drawer face. And once I had them all clamped securely and lined up exactly where I wanted them, I opened the drawers and used a countersink bit on the inside to pre-drill some holes, and then I attached each drawer face with just a little 1-inch screw. Well, not a little 1-inch screw. I used like 3 1-inch screws in each drawer face. But you get the picture. There's 1, there's 2, and there's 3. And with that, my desk was complete. In the next few days, I managed to get more of those felt tiles in stock, and I got the rest of the room fitted, and it was looking pretty darn snazzy. I got my computer in there, and I gotta tell you, it felt really good to finally come out of the closet. It felt good. Well, phrase that differently. If I would no longer was doing voiceovers in the closet, is what I meant to say. I have a place to actually do that now. And those tiles work pretty darn good too. Sure, mistakes were made along the way, but in the end, we got it done, and that's what matters.
Oh, hi. Hey, this video is sponsored by Squarespace, which is the website I'm currently looking at right now. And our website, if I do say so myself, is pretty dang fly. Dope. Crackin'. What do kids say nowadays? Anyways, we got a sweet website, and we're not even web designers. We're just able to do it ourselves on Squarespace, because Squarespace makes it really simple and easy to have a professional looking website, and you don't even really have to know what you're doing. Let me show you what ours looks like. The thing I love about Squarespace is it's completely customizable, so you can make a website that's exactly what you need for your business. So for us, we've got our goods up here, which is all of our merchandise. You can buy cool hats and shirts and coffee mugs, banners, things like that. But then you also can upload digital downloadable stuff. So all of our plans are right there if you want to build some fancy furniture. And then there's links to our Backstage Pass, which is how you can support us over on Patreon and get backstage access to all of our cool stuff. I can view it on my computer or I can view it on my tablet, and they're even mobile optimized so you can view it on your smartphone. Because let's be honest, everybody's on their smartphone more than their computer. So it's important that the website looks good on your phone. You can add a shopping cart with unlimited quantities of products, so you can put anything you want up there. You want to sell your teeth one by one? You can do that on Squarespace, although I don't recommend that part of selling things. All right, so here's what you're going to want to do. When you're ready to build a smoking hot website, man, I'm using all the great vernacular in this one. You go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, you go to squarespace.com/bourbonmothwoodworking and you get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. It's that easy. Go to Squarespace, website, boom. Yeah, Squarespace. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed that video. I'm just joking, this microphone's not even hooked up. Anyways, hope you enjoyed that video. Boy, did I make a lot of mistakes. Like, a lot of mistakes. Guess that's what happens when you rush and try and do something over the course of 2 days. Next time I'll try and slow it down a little bit and hopefully do a better job for you guys. But mistakes are the best way to learn, and hopefully you learn something. Remember, check out the video description for links to products and Patreon and my website. Get yourself some merch. Until next time, gotta find those puppies again. Where are they? Puppies. Oh, that's a cute one. Whoa, that one looks like a fat man.